Welcome to the part 4 of the video. In this video, we are going to learn about basic features of inductive and deductive reasoning and their uses in courts. This is as per the syllabus stated by or mentioned by Mumbai University on its website. This is for the first year BA LLB students. First, let's look at the definition of inductive and deductive reasoning. Let's start with the inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning starts with specific observation, very important, or evidence, and moves towards broader generalization or theories. It involves probabilistic reasoning. This also we have to remember, probabilistic reasoning, where conclusions are likely but not certain. When something is probable, it is possible. Probabilistic means possible. So the conclusions are likely but not certain. Example, the last 5 times this issue arose, the court ruled similarly. Therefore, it is likely the court will rule the same way in this case also. So this is a probabilistic method of reasoning. Whereas deductive reasoning begins with a general principle or rule and applies it to a specific situation to derive a logically certain conclusion. So here the conclusion is certain in deductive reasoning, whereas in inductive reasoning the conclusion is probabilistic or probable or possible but not certain, whereas in deductive reasoning it is certain. Let's look at an example. Under the law, theft is defined as taking property without consent. This is premise 1. The defendant took the property without consent. This is premise 2. Therefore, the conclusion comes the defendant committed theft. So this is a deductive reasoning. This is the structure of the deductive reasoning. Now let's look at the key differences between inductive and deductive reasoning. So inductive reasoning moves from specific observation or instances, that is, it starts from specific observation or instances, whereas deductive reasoning starts from general principles or rules. So earlier we had seen deductive argument starts with all. General means it includes all or none. So this is like a universal positive or universal affirmative and universal negative. So which I'll explain later in the videos that will be coming up. So basically inductive reasoning starts with specific observation, deductive reasoning starts with general principle. And it moves, what is the direction of that inductive reasoning? So it moves from specific observation to general proposition or general premise. Whereas deductive reasoning moves from general premise to specific premise. From general conclusion to specific premise, not general premise, but moves from general premises to specific conclusions. Correct. Whereas inductive reasoning moves from specific premises to general conclusion. Certainty. In inductive reasoning, the certainty is not there, which we already read about earlier. So the conclusions are probable, they are not certain, whereas the conclusions are logically certain in deductive reasoning. In inductive reasoning, it is often used to form hypotheses or theories. So we use this in criminal law. And in deductive reasoning, we use this to apply laws or precedents. Examples of inductive reasoning is, most witnesses lie under pressure, hence this witness may be lying. So this is a possibility. It may be true, but it is not certain. Whereas in deductive reasoning, the conclusion is certain, as we saw earlier. If all A are B and C is A, then C is B. Basically, we are substituting A in this particular premise. We are substituting A for B. Therefore, we say, so basically A is B, we know that, and C is A. So we also say that C is B. You can read this 2-3 times just to understand this if you haven't. Let's move forward. Uses of inductive reasoning in courts. Basically, inductive reasoning is probabilistic. It moves from specific instance to general conclusion. That is what we saw earlier. So, building generalization from evidence. Courts use inductive reasoning to analyze patterns in case evidence and witness testimonies. Example, in a fraud case, if multiple instances of similar fraudulent activities are observed, a general conclusion about the defendant's intent may be drawn. So we can say that the defendant was found guilty, or rather was seen committing multiple fraudulent activities, or multiple fraudulent activities have been, the police has registered those cases on him. So a certain conclusion may be drawn that the defendant's intent may be to defraud others. Predicting judicial outcomes. Lawyers rely on patterns of previous judgments to predict how a court might rule on a particular issue. For example, if the defendant was seen near the crime scene and had a motive, it may be inferred that the defendant committed the crime. And inductive reasoning helps link multiple pieces of circumstantial evidence to build a cohesive theory of the case. So, when we are predicting judicial outcome, we saw earlier that lawyers rely on patterns of previous judgments to predict how a court might rule on a particular issue. For example, if past cases involve similar facts led to a conviction, lawyer might argue that their case warrants a similar ruling. Use of deductive reasoning in courts. Applying legal rules. Deductive reasoning is crucial for applying established laws or legal principles to specific cases. Example, major premise. The law states that driving under the influence is a punishable offense. Minor premise. The defendant was caught driving under the influence. Therefore, the defendant is punishable under the law. Analyzing contracts and statutes. Deductive reasoning is used to interpret the terms of contracts or statutory provisions to determine whether they apply to a given situation. Example, a statute requiring registration for vehicles used for commercial purposes can be applied deductively to a company using vans for deliveries. So there is no thinking here. Everything is fact based. So there are laws, needs to be applied, and then it is applicable to everyone. Establishing legal precedents. Courts use deductive reasoning to apply ratio decidendi, that is a principle or rule of law on which a court's decision is based, from earlier cases to new, similar cases. Advantages and limitations of each reasoning type in legal decision making. What are the advantages and limitations of inductive reasoning? In inductive reasoning, basically it becomes useful in cases where there is incomplete information or circumstantial evidence. Inductive reasoning promotes adaptability and consideration of unique case factors. So where we don't have evidence, or evidence is not very much trustworthy or reliable, then we use inductive reasoning. The limitation is that the conclusions are probabilistic and may lead to uncertainty. It relies heavily on the quality and the quantity of the observation. These are its disadvantages. Let's look at the advantages of deductive reasoning. It ensures logical consistency and precision in legal argumentation. It provides, because the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises, therefore it ensures logical consistency and precision in legal arguments. It provides definitive conclusion when the premises are true and applicable. If the premises are true, the conclusion will be true. Limitation. It depends on the accuracy of the premises. So in deductive reasoning, accuracy of the premises is very important. If the premises are not accurate, then the conclusion will be false. Incorrect premises lead to faulty conclusions. It is less flexible in addressing unique or unprecedented cases. So any unique cases which comes up where therein most probably the deductive argument would not be applicable, as these have not been addressed earlier. So we use inductive argument in its place. Comparison of their roles in judicial reasoning. Inductive reasoning. It plays a crucial role in building cases, especially during the investigation phase and in trials involving circumstantial evidence. So wherever there is a trial involving circumstantial evidence or during the investigation phase, inductive reasoning is or inductive arguments are used. It helps judges and juries consider the likelihood of events or patterns when direct evidence is unavailable. So whenever direct evidence is not available, we use inductive reasoning. So all of these points we can also use in distinguish between if it comes in our question paper. Let's look at deductive reasoning. Dominates the application of legal principles. All legal principles, all statutes, all acts, they already state what will happen in what situation. So if somebody has taken somebody else's property without their consent, without their knowing, then it's a theft. And if, let's say, a person takes somebody's property without the knowledge of that person, then he has committed theft. And therefore the statute, the laws, the acts provide for certain punishments to the person who has done theft. So that is deductive reasoning. So that dominates the application of legal principles, statutory interpretations, and logical analysis of arguments in appellate and higher courts. So we use deductive arguments for all statutes, acts, laws which are already stated and established. Ensures that legal decisions adhere to established laws and precedents. Very simple. These are we can just move on to the next one. Examples of use in courts. Inductive reasoning example. In criminal trial, the prosecution might use inductive reasoning to argue specific facts. The defendant was seen purchasing a weapon, was near the crime scene, and had a motive. So therefore the general conclusion, that is the inductive conclusion, would be that it is likely that the defendant committed the crime. It is probable but not certain. Deductive reasoning example. In a civil case, major premise. Under contract law, if a party breaches a valid agreement, they must pay damages. Minor premise. The defendant breached the agreement by failing to deliver goods. Therefore, the conclusion is that the defendant must pay damages. So, if a party breaches a valid agreement, they must pay damage. The defendant breached the agreement, therefore the defendant must pay damage. So this has a structure. Premise 1, premise 2 will lead to an inference and then the conclusion. So let's conclude this by looking at both inductive and deductive reasoning are essential in legal contexts. Inductive reasoning helps build a hypothesis and analyze evidence, making it indispensable during investigations and trials. So inductive reasoning can be used during investigation phase and trial phase. Deductive reasoning ensures logical consistency and the proper application of legal principles, making it fundamental in judgments and legal reasoning. Together, these reasoning methods enable courts to arrive at fair, just, and logical sound decisions. Now, let's look at question and answers which are most likely to come in our exam paper. So, basic features of inductive and deductive reasoning. Let's define inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning involves starting with specific observation or evidence and moving towards broader generalization or conclusion. It is probabilistic, meaning the conclusion is likely but not guaranteed. Question 2. Define deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning starts with a general principle, all or none, like that, or rules, and applies it to a specific situation to derive a logically certain conclusion. In earlier videos, we have already taken the example of Socrates that you can refer to even from your books. Next, let us look at question 3. What is the key difference between inductive and deductive reasoning? Inductive reasoning moves from specific observation to general conclusions and provides probable conclusions, whereas deductive reasoning moves from general principle to specific conclusions and provides logically certain conclusions. Question 4. Give an example of inductive reasoning in general terms. If you observe that all swans seen so far are white, you might conclude that all swans are white. So this is an inductive reasoning because this is by way of observation. It is probabilistic. There is a probability that there could be a swan which is not white. Question 5. Give an example of deductive reasoning in general terms. Major premise, all mammals are warm-blooded. Minor premise, whales are mammals, therefore whales are warm-blooded. This is an example of deductive reasoning. What are the key features of inductive reasoning? Inductive reasoning is based on specific observations or instances. Conclusions are probable but not certain. It is often used to predict outcomes or identify patterns. It is used in the investigation phase and during the trial. What are the key features of deductive reasoning? Based on general principles or rules, conclusions are logically certain. If premises are true, very important, if premises are true, then conclusions are also true or logically certain. It relies on structured logical formats like syllogisms. I explained earlier what is syllogism. Syllogism is made up of two or more premises, one or more premises, and a conclusion. So that's the structure, the format, the form of deductive reasoning. What is the role of evidence in inductive reasoning? Evidence forms the basis for identifying patterns and generalizations in inductive reasoning. Evidence forms the basis for identifying patterns and generalization in inductive reasoning. The quality and quantity of evidence significantly affect the strength of the conclusion. Very important this is. What is the role of evidence in inductive reasoning? Because in inductive reasoning we do not have evidence, but the evidence is in the form of some kind of pattern or some kind of generalization or observation. So we use that kind of evidence to come to an inductive reasoning. Here, when we use inductive reasoning, the quality of the evidence, that is how good that evidence is or how much evidence we have, that significantly affects the strength of the conclusion. What is the role of premises in deductive reasoning? In deductive reasoning, premises serve as the foundational truth or principles from which specific conclusions are logically derived. So if the structure is the same, that is one premise 2, that is major premise, minor premise, and then a conclusion. But if the premises are true or false, it doesn't matter. If the form, because logic is not concerned with the content, it is rather concerned with the form or the structure of the argument. Use of the inductive reasoning in courts. How is inductive reasoning used in analyzing evidence in courts? Inductive reasoning helps link specific pieces of evidence to form a general conclusion about what likely occurred. For example, if multiple witnesses report seeing the defendant near the crime scene, it could be inferred that the defendant was present. Question 11. Provide an example of inductive reasoning in circumstantial evidence. Answer 11. Fact 1. The defendant's fingerprints were found at the crime scene. The defendant was seen near the crime scene shortly before the crime. Conclusion is that the defendant is likely involved in the crime. So we found the fingerprints. We observed that the defendant's fingerprints were found. We also observed that he was seen near the crime scene shortly before the crime actually happened, and therefore we can conclude, if that's an inductive conclusion or inductive reasoning, that the defendant may be likely involved in that crime. It is possible, probabilistic, but not certain. How do lawyers use inductive reasoning to predict judicial outcomes? Lawyers analyze past judgments with similar facts to predict how the court might rule in a new case. For example, if courts consistently convict for a particular offense under similar circumstances, lawyer may argue for a similar ruling. Question 13. What are the limitations of using inductive reasoning in courts? Conclusions are not guaranteed to be true. They are probabilistic. They are not certain. They are probable. The inductive reasoning heavily reliant or heavily relies on the quality and the relevance of the observation. That is the quality and the quantity of the observation. It is susceptible to overgeneralization or biases. One can be biased or one can generalize certain things, and that could be a bottleneck or a red flag for using inductive reasoning. It could backfire. Use of deductive reasoning in courts. How is deductive reasoning used to apply legal principles or legal rules? Deductive reasoning applies established laws to specific cases. Very important, established laws to specific cases. Example 1. Major premise. Theft involves taking property without consent. Premise 2 or minor premise is that the defendant took the property without consent, therefore the defendant committed theft. That's the conclusion. So it is the deductive reasoning applies established laws to specific cases. So it moves from general premises to specific conclusion. Question 15. How does deductive reasoning help in statutory interpretation? Deductive reasoning helps judges determine whether the facts of a case fall within the scope of a statute by applying the statute's general principles to specific circumstances. So this is where deductive reasoning is used by the judges. So judges look at the statutes, that is the law books, the acts, and see whether the statute's principles, general principles, which is applicable to everybody, does it apply to this specific case also. So that is where deductive reasoning is used. Give an example of deductive reasoning in precedent application. So deductive reasoning in precedent application. So generally we use precedent in inductive argument, but now in this question we are saying give an example of deductive reasoning in precedent application. So major premise. A legal precedent states that negligence occurs if a person fails to act as a reasonable person would under similar circumstances. Minor premise is that the defendant failed to act reasonably in the given situation. Therefore, the conclusion is defendant was negligent. So here what has happened is we have used a legal precedent. Although it may be likely, but it is not certain. But now here what we have done is there is a legal precedent in this case that any negligent, if a person is negligent and if he acts in an unreasonable manner, then he is likely to be found guilty for negligence. Question 17. What are the limitations of deductive reasoning in courts? Deductive reasoning depends on the accuracy of its premises. Incorrect or incomplete premises lead to flawed conclusion. So it is very important for would-be advocates or students to know that the accuracy of the premises is very important. The truth value of the premises is very important. It may not accommodate unique or unprecedented case scenarios. Let's look at the comparison of inductive and deductive reasoning. Which type of reasoning provides absolute certainty? Of course, it is deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning provides absolute certainty provided the premises are true and the reasoning is valid. Question 19. Why is inductive reasoning considered probabilistic? It is because it draws general conclusion from specific evidence, which means the conclusion is likely but not guaranteed. Question 20. In which phase of trial is inductive reasoning most commonly used? Inductive reasoning is most commonly used during the investigative phase and during trials, especially when analyzing circumstantial evidences. Question 21. In which phase of a trial is deductive reasoning most commonly used? Deductive reasoning is most commonly used in judicial decision making and applying legal principles during judgments. So this is used by the judges of the courts in making judicial decisions or taking judicial decisions or applying legal principles. Practical application in courts. How is inductive reasoning used in forming arguments during a trial? Lawyers use specific pieces of evidence to infer broader conclusions such as intent or guilt. For instance, they might argue that repeated similar actions demonstrate a pattern of behavior. So this is where inductive reasoning is used in forming arguments during a trial. So let's go through this again. Lawyers use specific pieces of evidence to infer broader conclusions. So they take up an evidence and expand it to cover broader conclusions such as intent or guilt. So the lawyer's task is to prove that the person intended or had the guilty mind or guilty action, had a guilt. If that is proved, then the judgment can come in his favor. For instance, they might argue, that is the lawyer might argue that repeated similar action demonstrates a pattern of behavior. Any pattern or observation is a inductive reasoning. How is deductive reasoning used in delivering judgments? Judges apply legal principles to the specific facts of a case to reach a conclusion. For example, they may deductively determine liability by checking if all elements of a tort are met. Tort is a civil liability. Why is it important for lawyers to use both types of reasoning? Lawyers need inductive reasoning to build a hypothesis and analyze evidence, and deductive reasoning to construct logically sound legal arguments and apply laws. How do judges balance inductive and deductive reasoning in judicial reasoning? Judges use inductive reasoning to consider evidence and patterns in testimonies, and deductive reasoning to apply statutes, precedents, and legal principles to reach a decision. Advantages of each type of reasoning. Question 26. What are the advantages of inductive reasoning in legal contexts? It helps in analyzing incomplete or circumstantial evidence, and inductive reasoning encourages adaptability and broader consideration of case facts. What are the advantages of deductive reasoning in legal contexts? Deductive reasoning ensures logical consistency and clarity, and it provides definitive conclusion when premises are accurate. General questions. Can a court decision rely solely on inductive reasoning? Why or why not? The courts rarely rely solely on inductive reasoning because its conclusions are not certain. Deductive reasoning is needed to ensure logical consistency and adherence to legal principles. Question 29. How do legal systems ensure a balance between inductive and deductive reasoning? So, by combining the two, that is, inductive reasoning is used for analyzing evidence and identifying patterns, while deductive reasoning ensures decisions align with established law and precedents. So both are required to be used by both the lawyers and the judges. Question 30. Why is understanding these reasoning types essential for law students? Understanding inductive and deductive reasoning helps law students construct strong arguments, evaluate evidence critically, and apply legal principles accurately in diverse scenarios. So why is understanding these reasoning types essential for law students? Basically, both inductive and deductive reasoning helps law students construct strong arguments, evaluate evidence critically, and apply legal principles accurately in diverse situations. Thank you for listening patiently to this long video. If it helps, share it with your friend, like and subscribe. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.